What goes through the mind of a teenager who just heard they'll spend the rest of their life behind bars? What emotions flash across their face when the judge sentences them for actions that destroyed so many lives? In this video, we'll explore 15 shocking cases of juvenile offenders who committed unimaginable crimes. You'll witness their immediate reactions in the courtroom. From hysterical outbursts to icy calm to crushing remorse, and see how the reality of their future mercilessly etches itself into their expressions. Number 15. Damon Kemp. Courtroom explosion. How far can denial go when faced with overwhelming evidence? The case of Damon Kemp shows one of the most extreme reactions. 19-year-old Damon Kemp stood trial accused of the death of his teenage peers. The bail hearing was charged with emotion from the start, but what followed shocked everyone present. When it seemed the judge was leaning towards an unfavorable decision, Kemp exploded. He began shouting loudly, eyes bulging with horror and anger. He invoked God as his witness, proclaimed his innocence, and cried uncontrollably. "I didn't do it! God, you are my witness!" he screamed across the room, his voice breaking with desperation. Then he turned to the devastated families of the victims and continued his emotional, accusatory monologue. The judge tried to interrupt and calm him several times, but Kemp was unstoppable. His gestures were wild, hands flying uncontrollably through the air as he accused the system, the police, and practically anyone who came to mind. The contrast between his almost hysterical behavior and the deadly, serious charges was striking. What was behind such a reaction? Was it sheer fear of the consequences? An expression of crushing guilt his psyche couldn't process? A calculated manipulation to evoke sympathy, or a genuine psychological shock from confronting reality? Psychologists explain that individuals facing extreme stress and the threat of lifelong consequences may react in various ways, including intense emotional outbursts that can be manifestations of both denial and deep mental distress. The judge, despite the dramatic scene, denied bail. Kemp's emotional outburst brought him no relief, instead only underscoring the gravity of the situation and his apparent inability to face the consequences of his actions. His loud cries and sobs remain a chilling reminder of that harsh moment when reality hit crushingly and his future shrank to a life behind bars. Number 14. Jacob Morgan. Autism and a tragic fire. Could a boy with autism really have started the fatal fire that took his little brother's life? Or did he become a victim of a system that didn't fully understand his condition? 17-year-old Jacob Morgan, a teenager diagnosed with autism, was sentenced to 15 years in prison for starting a fire that killed his 14-month-old stepbrother, Joshua. His case opened complex questions about justice and understanding for people with autism within the legal system. The tension in the case stemmed from a sharp contradiction. On one side stood Jacob's family, who vehemently claimed he was innocent. His mother, Julie Dover, steadfastly defended him in the courtroom. The family believed Jacob had tried to save little Joshua from the flames. Against this stood the prosecution's evidence. It pointed to Jacob's fascination with fire. He admitted that fire intrigued him, and had even started another fire on the property just 2 weeks before the tragedy. Investigators found traces of 2 separate fires, one in the living room and another in Joshua's bedroom. Jacob first claimed he accidentally threw a pillow at the heater, but later admitted he intentionally set it on fire and threw it in the air. The defense emphasized that Jacob's developmental issues, including difficulties with reading and writing, made him vulnerable to manipulation. They pointed especially to a 5-hour unrecorded interrogation with investigators, during which his confession may have been forced or obtained under pressure. Studies show that people with autism spectrum disorders may have specific difficulties during interrogations and are more susceptible to false confessions. Jacob was ultimately convicted, despite lingering doubts. The court verdict left a bitter taste of uncertainty and the question of whether justice was truly served, or whether the system failed to protect a vulnerable individual. His quiet reaction when the sentence was handed down sharply contrasted with the dramatic outbursts in other cases we'll see. Number 13. Philip Chisum, murder of a teacher at 14. What drives a 14-year-old boy to commit such a brutal act against someone who was supposed to be a role model and authority figure? In October 2013, Philip Chisum, a ninth-grade student at Danvers High School in Massachusetts, committed an act that shook the entire town. At the age of just 14, he murdered his 24-year-old math teacher, Colleen Ritzer. Ritzer, known for her cheerful nature and dedication to students, had asked Chisum to stay after school that day, unaware of the terrible plan he had already devised. The details of the crime were chilling. Chisum followed Ritzer to the bathroom, where he brutally attacked her and took her life. The next morning, police apprehended Chisum. He still had Ritzer's blood on his hands, not even attempting to wash it off. This incriminating evidence sealed his guilt. The court proceedings that followed this horrific event were filled with strong emotions. Chisum himself appeared shocked and speechless. What can such a young perpetrator expect for such an abhorrent act? Chisum was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. At the moment the sentence was pronounced, this young offender realized he would spend the best years of his life behind bars. The contrast between his ruined future and the destroyed life of the victim and her family was devastating. Number 12. Roxanna Sikorski, conspiracy against her own family. Can a traumatic past and manipulative love drive a 15-year-old girl to plan the murder of her own family? For Roxanna Sikorski, this became a reality. In October 2014, this 15-year-old girl was sentenced to 10 years in prison. She had planned to kill her adoptive family and attempted to attack a sleeping sibling. The courtroom experienced strong emotions when her parents, the intended victims, surprisingly pleaded for mercy. What led to such a turn of events? Roxanna's family stood by her throughout the entire process. They described her as an emotionally fragile child with a difficult past. They revealed that she had been adopted from Poland and had experienced trauma before falling under the influence of her 23-year-old manipulative boyfriend. So was Roxanna more a victim of circumstances, or did she coldly plan? The defense questioned whether Roxanna fully understood her confession, which was later dismissed, and also if she comprehended the consequences of her plea deal. Her mother expressed concerns that Roxanna may not have understood what her legal representative was advising her, and didn't fully realize the gravity of the situation. The parents hoped these circumstances and her past would lead to a more lenient sentence. When Roxanna heard her sentence, she began to cry and expressed remorse. The defense emphasized that her mental health issues, caused by experiences in Poland and from her biological family, along with the influence of her older boyfriend, led to her actions. The court convicted Roxanna, but apparently took mitigating circumstances into account. A drama unfolded in the courtroom where guilt mingled with compassion. Roxanna's reaction reflected confusion and perhaps a flash of understanding the consequences, while her family experienced their own hell. Number 11. Jalil Smith Riley, life without the possibility of parole. What happens when a perpetrator tries to withdraw his murder confession at the last minute, but the judge remains unyielding? Jalil Smith. Riley was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole in 2003. He committed the murder of a young woman, Portia Brooks, and seriously injured her partner, Aaron Martin. From the beginning, the courtroom was filled with intense emotions and loud expressions of grief and anger from both the victims' families and Riley's family. Tension in the courtroom escalated even further when Smith Riley attempted to retract his previous guilty plea. At the same time, he requested that the death penalty be removed as one of the options. It was a dramatic proceeding. During it, Riley even collapsed. His family desperately pleaded with the judge for leniency, pointing out that he had no prior criminal history and believed in his ability to reform. On the contrary, the devastated families of the victims adamantly demanded the harshest possible punishment. However, Judge Charles Q. Becky firmly rejected Riley's request. He imposed the maximum sentence, life without the possibility of parole. After the verdict, Portia Brooks' mother said that Smith Riley had taken her daughter's life, and it was time for her family to begin the healing process. Riley's defense attorney stated that he had never encountered a client who attempted to withdraw a guilty plea during the sentencing process. Despite Riley's desperate efforts and the emotional pleas of his family, the judge remained unmoved. The moment Jalil Smith Riley heard the final verdict confirming life imprisonment, his face reflected the ultimate realization. All doors had definitively closed for him. His future had shrunk to a life spent behind bars. The emotional roller coaster in the courtroom thus reached its harsh peak. Number 10. Jennifer Mee, the Hiccup Girl and Murder. Can a girl known to the public mainly for her constant hiccups really plan a robbery that tragically ends in death? The case of Jennifer Mee, nicknamed Hiccup Girl, shocked many. Jennifer was found guilty of first-degree murder and faced life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her nickname stemmed from her unusual medical condition, persistent hiccups, which attracted public attention and created a stark contrast between her seemingly fragile image and the severity of the crime she was convicted of. When the verdict was announced, emotions flooded the courtroom. Jennifer Mee broke down in tears. Family members on both sides reacted with visible distress. Her mother was deeply affected by the outcome. The victim's mother, in her grief, spoke to the media and emphasized that no outcome would bring her son back and that she would focus on honoring his memory. She also expressed gratitude to the state for their support during the trial. Prosecutors presented evidence suggesting that Jennifer Mee had planned the crime. She recruited others to participate in the botched robbery, thus orchestrating the events leading to the victim's death. Her defense attorney, John Trevina, chose not to comment on the case. The prospect of spending the rest of her life in prison without a chance of release weighed heavily on her. Jennifer Mee was sentenced to life in prison. The moment the Hiccup Girl heard the words guilty and life, her face revealed the true weight of the situation, far from the media curiosity. The courtroom witnessed a tragedy for all involved. Number 9. Shaell Jackson, mocking the victims. What if the perpetrator's family shows no remorse, but mocks the victim's family in the courtroom? Shaell Jackson was sentenced to life in prison for assaulting Nathan Potter with a firearm during a robbery, which led to Potter's death. The shocking behavior of Jackson's family added a painful dimension to the case. Instead of remorse, Jackson's relatives mocked and provoked the grieving Potter family from the back of the courtroom. This display of disrespect contributed to their emotional suffering. Nathan's 13-year-old sister Sarah was deeply affected. With tears, she remembered her brother as a loving person and described sleepless nights of grief after his death, emphasizing the lasting emotional scars. Jackson's defense attorney asked the judge to consider Jackson's youth and lack of impulse control. However, the drama, underscored by the insensitive behavior of Jackson's family, overshadowed his request. The relatives' actions, showing a complete lack of remorse, likely destroyed any chance for a more lenient sentence. This is an example of secondary victimization, where victims' families are forced to endure additional trauma during the legal process. Jackson was sentenced to life in prison. His family's actions added another cruel layer to the tragedy. Jackson's fate, combined with the disgraceful behavior of his loved ones, showed a profound absence of empathy. It emphasized the inconsolable suffering of the Potter family, who were forced to endure additional pain while justice was served in a very harsh manner. Number 8. David Meyers, arson and remorse. Can a perpetrator of a horrific crime truly regret his actions? And if so, does his remorse carry any weight in the face of devastated survivors whose world he turned upside down? 19-year-old David Meyers from Buffalo, New York, stood before Judge Christopher Burns, dressed in an orange prison uniform and shackled. Meyers pleaded guilty to second-degree arson and to taking the life of 52-year-old Brian Dominic by setting fire to his house in South Buffalo. His legal representative pointed out Meyers' cooperation with the police, providing detectives with a full confession. This fact was taken into consideration when determining the sentence. Judge Christopher Burns ultimately sentenced him to life in prison with a minimum term of 20 years. Before the court, Meyers addressed the judge, admitted his full responsibility, and expressed deep remorse for his actions. He stated that he could not fully make amends for what he had done and wished he could reverse his terrible actions. At the same time, he acknowledged that such a request was impossible, thus emphasizing the gravity of his actions and the consequences he now faces. The community was shocked by the brutal nature of this crime. During the trial, it came to light that Meyers and Dominic had a heated argument before the fatal incident, providing some insight into the circumstances that led to the fatal catastrophe. Meyers was visibly distressed as he spoke to the judge. The weight of his actions and the inevitability of punishment weighed heavily on him. Psychologists admit that perpetrators can show genuine remorse, but warn that it can also be a calculated expression aimed at influencing the court. Distinguishing true remorse from strategy is often difficult. Meyers was sentenced to a long term, despite his words of remorse. That moment when Meyers faced the direct consequences, his words of remorse against the silent, immeasurable pain of the bereaved, transformed the courtroom into a place where the attempt at repentance clashed with irreparable and permanent loss. Number 7. Murder and the Accutane defense. Can an acne medication really drive a 15-year-old boy to murder? That was the main question in the case of Aiden von Grabo. This 15-year-old boy faced a life sentence for stabbing Michaela Grody to death in November 2017. The act took place in the apartment where Michaela lived. Aiden's defense unsuccessfully attempted to blame the acne medication Accutane. Throughout the entire trial, von Grabo showed very little remorse. The court and jury were not very receptive to such an unexpected defense. Lawyers argued that Accutane could have caused depression, increased aggression, and even states of insanity in Aiden, trying to find a direct link between the medication and the violent act committed. However, this strategy failed in court, as the district attorney's office quickly filed charges against Aiden and pushed for him to be tried as an adult. Moreover, witnesses clearly identified him at the crime scene. His indifferent behavior and apparent lack of remorse over Michaela's death likely only contributed to the severity of the final verdict. Cases where the defense uses such unusual strategies, like blaming medications, occasionally appear but are rarely successful. Aiden von Grabo was thus sentenced to life in prison, and his defense failed. His cold expression when he heard the final verdict only underscored his apparent indifference and the failure of this desperate attempt at defense. The courtroom thus witnessed the sad end of a very unusual legal battle. Number 6. Gavin Ramsey, strangling his great-aunt and mental health. when nightmares from a diary become reality. What did Gavin Ramsey's notes reveal about his mental state before he strangled his 98-year-old great-aunt, Margaret Douglas, in January 2019? This crime deeply affected the community in Wadsworth, Ohio. The discovery of Douglas's body in her home, along with a single shoe, sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Wadsworth Police Chief Randy Rinke described the case as the worst crime he had witnessed in his 28 years of service. During the trial, Gavin's mother, Christine, testified about her son's mental health problems and her efforts to seek help through counseling and medication. She recounted his disturbing behavior, including descriptions of his intentions recorded in a notebook. These notes suggested that his great-aunt was just a warm-up for potential future victims. The Douglas family actively participated in the court proceedings. They hoped to draw attention to pending legislation aimed at abolishing life sentences without the possibility of parole for juvenile offenders. However, their efforts were unsuccessful, as the legislation was eventually passed. Details about his mental issues were presented to the court to provide context for his actions. How did the court consider Ramsey's mental state and these disturbing omens in the face of the brutality of the act? The relationship between mental disorders and violent behavior in juveniles is complex and raises ethical questions about punishing young people with mental health issues. Ramsey was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. His face, when confronted with the consequences of his actions and details from his own diary, underscored the gravity of the situation. The courtroom became a stage where the brutality of the act clashed with questions about guilt, sanity, and justice. We hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to check out more videos we've prepared for you, click on one of them on the screen or visit our channel. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell. Thank you for watching.